Hello everyone, this is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. This episode is going to be part of the series on my channel called Type 1 Diabetics Talk, where guests and guests are Type 1 diabetics, and we talk about Type 1 diabetes. However, today's episode is a special one because the two guests you see on the screen are not Type 1 themselves. Their children are Type 1 diabetics, and in order to manage their children's diabetes properly, they've had to learn how to learn about Type 1 diabetes and the different ways that you can manage Type 1 diabetes. Jill and Lester, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thanks for having us.
Jill, let's start with you, and I will move on to Lester. Just where are you speaking from, and what's your name, and tell us about your son as well.
Well, my name is Jill Litzinger, and we live in Missouri in the United States. And my son is Joshua, and he was diagnosed when he was 10 years old. So we had noticed some of the classic symptoms. He, started wetting the bed at 10 years old. I thought that was a little odd, but I, kind of brushed it off and didn't really follow it up. So he ended up in DKA and then was diagnosed with Type 1.
That's quite a classic story of diagnosis, right? Children end up in hospital with DKA, and it's also very common for the symptoms to be put on other causes, or maybe it was cold at night, or maybe he's tired, or maybe he's just exercising too much, or maybe he's not eating well. Lester.
Hi, so I'm Lester Hightower. I'm speaking with you today from Florida in the United States. And my son is now an 18-year-old college freshman. And he was diagnosed about 6 weeks after his 5th birthday, so in 2010. So he'll reach his 14th year with diabetes this year. And we were fortunate in that we did not have a DKA event. My wife and I noticed the symptoms and signs and Googled them and actually walked him into a pediatrician's office and said, we think he has Type 1 diabetes. Unfortunately, we didn't get diagnosed that day. We got referred, but a couple of days later, we did get diagnosed in an endocrinology office, and he was not in DKA. He was hospitalized for 3 days, primarily just so we could go through education. He really probably didn't need to be hospitalized. And we did the typical, ADA guidelines, USDA food pyramid, high carb training, came home with that training, tried to implement it. It was a disaster. And fortunately, did some research on Amazon, bought a bunch of diabetes books. One of them happened to be Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, and we sort of adopted low carb right away. So Andrew not only is 14 years almost into his diagnosis, but he's also almost 14 years into the Dr. Bernstein lifestyle. So he's a pretty good case study from ages 5 to 18 of what that looks like if you sort of stick to Bernstein's regimen.
It's interesting that you didn't drag it on.
So we did
you recognized the symptoms.
Yeah, we were lucky. So
what were those symptoms, Lester? What were some of those symptoms?
And I'll tell you, what happened, I think, is that I noticed it. I noticed the symptoms. The symptoms were frequent urination, unquenchable thirst. Those are the two predominant symptoms. And his mom had missed it. His teachers had missed it. But I left a job. I resigned and left a job, had a few months off before my next job. And so I went from seeing my son very little to seeing my son all the time. And I noticed it. And, I started noticing things like when he and I would try to attend a baseball game. It's about a 20-mile drive from my house to the baseball stadium in our town. And I couldn't make that drive without Andrew begging to stop and use the restroom. And he would also beg for Gatorade. It's 20 miles. I mean, it's just not that far, and so things just started catching my attention, and I started talking to my wife about it. And then if you Google those symptoms, frequent urination, unquenchable thirst, type 1 diabetes just pops right up.
Yeah.
And anyway, so we were fortunate in the sense that we noticed it. But I'll be honest with you, I think the reason that we noticed it is I went from spending very little time with him to spending a lot of time with him. And I think if you were sort of with him every day, you don't notice the slow changes. And I think we were lucky in that regard.
Mm. Yeah, I relate to that because I was also diagnosed at 5, so I was 5 years old. Yeah, Jill?
So the symptoms, gosh, what I noticed, so Josh was diagnosed right after Christmas. And before that, we had gone swimming. Just the other things that I noticed was behavior changes. He just became really not himself, grumpy. And I thought, wow, what is going on with him? And then we were swimming, and I noticed he was looking a little thin, and I thought to myself, oh, I need to make sure that he's eating better, and making sure that he really finishes his dinner. And tastes changed. He went from liking ketchup to suddenly wanting barbecue sauce on everything, and barbecue sauce had a little more sugar in it. Looking back, I can see why he made those changes. Suddenly didn't want protein, wanted Gatorade, like Lester said, he wanted Gatorade all of a sudden, which he hadn't really liked before. So there was a lot of these like subtle changes that didn't really, and since we didn't have type 1 in our family, but I was in the medical profession, I was a clinical lab scientist, so I had memorized, polydipsia, polyuria, memorized those symptoms, but when it was right in front of me, I just did not catch it. And so right after Christmas, he was laying in bed one day and he said, Mom, can you pick me up out of bed? And he was about 70 pounds at that point, or had been. So I said, sure. And I was expecting him to be heavy, and I just scooped him up, and he was light, so light. And I thought, gee, buddy, let's get you on the scale. Let's go downstairs and get you on the scale. So we went down and got on the scale, and he had lost about 20 pounds. And, he was 70 pounds. He didn't have 20 pounds to lose. So that's when I made the appointment, because I thought something's really wrong. Something's not right. And then I had noticed that he was going to the bathroom a lot. So I thought, oh, maybe it's a kidney infection, We'll get antibiotics and we'll be on our way. But I was laying on the bed with him, and he was very lethargic. He had gotten some video games for Christmas that he could go pick out. And instead of picking out the video games, he wanted to lay on the floor of the store. And I thought, yeah, something's really wrong. So then when we called and made the appointment, it's during Christmas time. It's in that time between Christmas and New Year's. And the doctors didn't want to see him because it was kind of a dead time. So they called and said, hey, do you really need to come in? And I said, yeah, we really need to come in. There's something going on. And he said, okay, well, can you come in earlier? Because they wanted to go home. And I said, yeah, I can come in earlier. So we went in. Thank God we went in, because he was in DKA, and not severe, but you think back and you think, what if I hadn't gone in? Because that night he had, as we were going in, and it was kind of a dramatic story because we had some flooding at that time, and the highways were closed, and it was raining, and the helicopter couldn't make it in, and so it was crazy. But we went in. The story was, we went into the doctor. The doctor was on the ball. He had been an ER doctor. He was an internal med doctor. Had never seen Josh before, and the nurse, when we came in, she said, oh, is he throwing up or something? And I said, yeah, he's throwing up a little bit. And she said, oh, he probably has a little cold. And I said, no, this isn't a cold. And so when the doctor came in, I took off Josh's shirt because you could see all his ribs. And I just looked at him, made eye contact and said, "This is not normal. What's going on?" And he just, at that point, looked at his hands. His hands were cracked and dry from dehydration. And he just looked at me and said, "I think he has type 1 diabetes. You need to go to the ER." And that was the beginning of our trip. And then to go a little further, once we made it to the ER and they, confirmed that, yeah, his blood sugar was 580, then they were going to transport us because they didn't have the facilities to handle a type 1 diagnosis, pediatric. So then they were transporting us to Children's in St. Louis. And so that was where we ended up eventually. But it was quite a story to get there to the hospital. But the highways thankfully opened up right as we needed to transport. And so that's where we transported. And I remember the ER doctor looking at me, and he said, he made eye contact looked at me and said, "Mom, sugar is poison." And I just remember that because then afterwards, the training that we got was kind of opposite of that. But anyway,
Yeah.
so that's our big dramatic story.
I'm looking at my conversion chart. Actually, there's one on the Low Carb and Fasting website. And we've created it to make it easy with color-coded. So the conversion from millimoles to milligrams. So 520, you said? 520 isn't even on my chart. So that's for anyone using millimoles, like people in the UK and Canada, that's way, way above 22. So probably somewhere in the 30s.
I can do it real quick.
You could do the conversion so quickly, Jill. And Lester, so tell us about, was it Andrew's diagnosis story?
Yeah, so the diagnosis, as I mentioned earlier, we were fortunate to catch it at home. I made the mistake, actually, of fasting him the night before we took him to the pediatrician because I just assumed they're going to want to do blood work on him. And by fasting him, he ended up with a blood sugar like in the mid 100s, like 154, 147. And they sent us home. And so I just wouldn't accept, being sent home. I said, "My child is sick." And I believed he had diabetes. And fortunately, I did get a referral to endo. And so when we went to endo 2 days later, I did not fast him that morning at breakfast. And so his blood sugar was almost 500. It was 480 something, I believe, in the endo's office. And so we were immediately diagnosed. But short of DKA, Andrew had lost, I don't know exactly how much weight he lost because we weren't really in the habit of weighing my child. But, his pediatrician visits, we have a record of him weighing 44 pounds a couple of months prior to his diagnosis. And he weighed 39 pounds on the day of diagnosis. So he'd lost probably at least 5 pounds, which is percentage-wise probably fairly close to what Jill just said, or maybe half of what Jill just said.
Yes.
But we weren't in life-threatening DKA, thank goodness. And he gained that weight back really quickly. But we came home, and I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons we probably caught it early is I was between jobs, which was a blessing. We came home, tried to implement, what we had taught, don't change anything, don't change your diet. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was literally blood sugar roller coaster from 40 to 400. I don't know how else to explain it. It was horrible. And I didn't want to live that way. It was frightening. It was scary. It was miserable. And so it's just the way that I am. My nature is to go try to seek out answers. And I typically do that from books, maybe a little bit differently now, almost 15 years later. But, books are typically the first place that I go. So I went to Amazon, typed in the word diabetes, and just started scrolling, reading reviews, built a basket. I think it had 5 or 6 books in it. Dr. Bernstein's was one of them, luckily. And it was for sure the largest one, almost 600 pages. It was very intense. It was not the first one that I read because it was just too intimidating. But when I got to Bernstein's book, and I actually read, when I got to the chapter on the laws of small numbers, I told my wife, I have found the way out. And so she and I discussed it, and it was that day or the day after, we emptied the pantry, threw away all the chips and bread and pasta, and started over. And immediately, we went from that roller coaster of 40 to 400 to something a lot more like 60 to 120. And that's a hell of a lot better life. And then, as we got better at it, we dialed that in even further. And here we are, 13 and a half years later, and Andrew's average A1C over those 13 and a half years is 5.0%. It's just wonderful. I'm so grateful.
Lester, when you mentioned that horrible range, you don't want anyone to live through that. I have personal experience. I've lived through that. And I cannot tell you how horrible you feel for days afterward, for days. And if that cycle is repeating every single day, you never have time to recover. You never have time to actually feel normal. Although I never ranged between 400 and 40, I do remember ranging between 320, for example, and 50, and that was all day long. You correct the high, you crash, you eat excessive amounts of carbohydrates. Now you're rising, and it goes on and on and on. But the worst thing, the saddest part for me was that all along I thought that I was a failure, because that was I wasn't specifically told I was a failure, but I actually remember my diabetes nurse told me, Nayiri, you have to be more proactive preventing these highs. What else can I do? I tried. It's not like I'm not dumb. I'm not a dumb person, but that was the implication. She didn't say it. She said, you have to be more smart.
Right.
How much more smart can you be? I tried everything, every strategy they were recommending, pre-bolusing, taking 80% in advance, taking 50%, 15 minutes in advance, and nothing ever worked. And then I heard Bernstein's genius, life-changing statement that it's almost impossible, and in fact, it says it is impossible to match your insulin peak to your blood sugar peak. And if it ever happens, that's by chance that the two curves met. And I never knew. I'd never heard of that. So that, for me, that changed my life, the law of small numbers. And now the law of small numbers, it's also important, Lester, because people assume that we're flatlining all day long.
Right.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so it's very straightforward for me. I mean, my approach, and I've said this several times, and many talks that I've given, I just visualize our goal as being long and shallow hills, as opposed to short and steep peaks.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually isn't a flat line. I mean, when you get a flat line, that's a great day, but that's actually not the goal. The goal is long and shallow hills, so that when you do have a high, it's slow and not steep, and you can correct it accurately, precisely, get yourself back on track. When you have a low, it's slow, it's not dangerous, and you can be confident in precisely correcting that low with glucose. And it's very different than being in a stochastic system of high carb and high ultra rapid insulin, where you actually don't really know exactly what to do, because you can't, it's so difficult to predict. The system is so stochastic, where if you go low carb, go low insulin, things just get slower. They get shallower, both on the high and the low side. And the inputs that you need to make to correct one way or the other are smaller. They're less scary. You're not going to raid the refrigerator. There's just so many things that come into play when you're not, in our case, I said 40 to 400, maybe it's, 40 to 300, but still you get the point. It's a roller coaster. really know exactly what to do, and you have a tendency to overreact. And it's life changing. And for a parent, I mean, you've lived it personally. You know, as a parent of a 5-year-old child, you're scared to death. I mean, he weighs 40 pounds. You know, 14 years ago today, he weighs 190 pounds. He's 6.5 feet tall. But back then, he was a little precious boy, and you're afraid of making a mistake. You know, if you don't wake up and he goes low, you know, does he survive the night? I mean, these are very frightening things as the parent of a young child. And so I had a lot of motivation. My wife and I had a lot of motivation to get off the blood sugar roller coaster. And frankly, Nayiri, I would say we had a lot of motivation to give up the highly addictive, highly processed carbohydrate foods which were in our house. And I'll be the first to admit, I didn't know any better. You know, we ate oatmeal. You know, we ate cold cereal. We ate, you know, rice-a-roni. We were, you know, doing the good old USDA, you know, dietary plan here in the USA. And so we had to learn, and then we had to change when we knew better, and we had to be committed to the change. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not so sure if I had not had a 5-year-old child with type 1 diabetes that I could have crossed that precipice. I mean, I was as carb addicted as anybody was. I was a cold cereal connoisseur. I was Jerry Seinfeld level. But I did have a 5-year-old child with type 1 diabetes, and it helped motivate my wife and me to make those changes, and they've paid off, and they're worthwhile, and we stick with them.
Jill?
Absolutely. Did you want me to talk
Talking
about
of the law of small numbers.
the law? Well, and like after we got home, how we discovered Bernstein. So a book, again, like Lester, a friend of mine, I was just in kind of survival mode. So we came home, and a friend of mine, a dear friend, sent me just a bunch of books. And in that, one of the books was a smaller book, and it was called The Challenge of Childhood Diabetes. And it just kind of related this one family's how they lived with type 1, what it was like to live with type 1. So I just kind of started with that book. And in that book, she mentions Dr. Bernstein and says that his book is probably the most important book ever written on type 1 diabetes. And I thought, wow, I need to, if this is the most important book, I need to find that book. So I got online and Googled Dr. Bernstein, and his YouTube channel came up. And then I watched a YouTube video from him, you know, just not knowing anything really, except that where we were, and just like Lester, we were, you know, anywhere his blood sugars were on a roller coaster, anywhere between, you know, I think our lowest was like 38 and, you know, 400 daily. And thinking that I wasn't that stupid, you know, I graduated college, I should be able to do this. And because the way you're taught in the hospital is, you know, very like it's just math, it's just mathematical. You just you add this and you subtract this and you end up with your insulin dose, and then you give it, and everything should be great. And it wasn't great. And so we were told in the hospital to limit carbohydrate to 100 grams per meal. We were told to give 3 15-gram snacks. So we were supposed to have 3 meals and 3 snacks. So a snack between lunch and dinner, a snack between breakfast and lunch, a snack between lunch and dinner, and a before bedtime snack. And it was just impossible. He was always either high or low, and that affected his behavior. And so it was just impossible. So going back, I was looking for a way out, and read that book. It referenced Dr. Bernstein, got on YouTube and looked up Dr. Bernstein, and this is in January of 2016. And Dr. Bernstein referenced type 1 grit. And I didn't even know I hadn't ever been in a Facebook group. I had a Facebook account, but I had never been on a Facebook group. So I Googled type 1 grit, and I think an article came up that RD had written And it like showed how his family was managing, and they were running on the beach and they were hopeful. And I thought, I need to talk to this guy. I need to find out what he's doing. I hadn't seen any normal graphs or anything, because I hadn't joined any of the diabetes groups, the mainstream groups. So all I knew was type 1 grit. And so I petitioned to join, and he handed me off to Allison to really make sure that I was actually somebody, because I think at that point they had been dealing with some pushback and people kind of trying to infiltrate the type 1 group. So they made sure that I was actually a mom who was looking for help. And at that point, they were making concessions to newly diagnosed people to, if you hadn't finished the Bernstein book, that you could still join. And I hadn't finished it even. I had downloaded on Kindle, and we were just we were 2 weeks into diagnosis. And I was just like, I have to do something different. This is just, we can't live this way. We weren't sleeping. I was sleeping. I had moved Josh into our room because the lows and the highs just happened so fast. They were just terrifying. It was, and that's what I try to drive home to when I speak to doctors or people that, don't really understand type 1. It's just the terror that you're living with every day as a parent, that your child might not wake up in the morning, or that you might make a mistake. And like Lester said, matching those two sharp peaks in time, you're eating your food and you're trying to put this insulin peak on top of it, and it just doesn't work. But if you're doing this, you have a lot better chance of matching those two. So yeah, I joined type 1 grit, and we haven't looked back. He's 18 now. He's had an A1C. So it took us, his A1C was 15.7 at diagnosis. And it took us 5 months of just continuous study and learning from people on type 1 grit and reading Dr. Bernstein's book, that we were just determined to normalize his blood sugars. And my dad also has type 2 and has kidney disease. So we were just I didn't want him to go down that path. So we were just determined we were going to figure it out. And we just kept working at it. It took us 5 months to get his A1C down to 5.5. And then we've just been in the 5s and 4s ever since. So 8+ years of pretty much, I think since about 2018, we've been pretty much 5.0 and below. So of A1C.
Well, for the audience, please stay with us, because at the end of this video, there will be a clip showing you pictures of Josh and Andrew from the day they were diagnosed to the young men and strong men that they are now. So please watch to the end of the video. Coming back to the symptoms, you were mentioning feeling horrible at, I don't know, just anywhere below 7. From experience, I can tell we also need to mention actually symptoms of dropping, because that process of dropping itself causes hypoglycemic symptoms. You don't even need to reach a hypoglycemic threshold. You actually feel hypoglycemic if you're dropping from 400 to and you're dropping sharply. So you feel hypoglycemic at pretty normal figures. In fact, I would say high figures like 140. I felt hypoglycemic at 140. And I touch myself and I think, okay, well, this, I used to use glucometer at the time. Well, maybe it's not accurate. I'll wash my hands again and check again, and I'm 141 and 142. Why am I shaking? I'm literally shaking. I can't focus. I'm hypoglycemic. That's because I've dropped sharply from 320 or 380. So no, that is not a good quality of life. I have to say, that's not normal.
It's so bad. They feel so bad. And my guy was a sweet little guy, and he just was difficult to deal with. He would just be so irritable and just so He had headaches all the time. He had tummy aches all the time. When we asked the doctors about this, they just kind of shrugged, like, we don't know. We don't know what's the problem, you know? And I thought, we can't do this. And it was after, I remember the moment, it was when we decided we were going to do something different. Because it's scary, you know, that there was not a whole lot of research on the low carb diet for kids at that point. And it was a little scary having to go off on our own. And, you know, but I had tried different things. You know, I thought, okay, well, let me try whole grain. Let me try, you know, we're going to eat brown rice. We're not going to eat white rice. We're going to switch to brown rice, you know, and it was a little better, but still not great, you know. And we're going to try, you know, I tried different things, you know, and I thought, we ate fairly healthy. We didn't do a lot of soda or, you know, but we still ate Cheerios and, you know, the regular things that people eat. And I remember the day when we used to do waffles, regular waffles on Sunday. That was our special thing. And he had regular waffles and, you know, regular syrup. And I did the math and I did everything, you know, and I thought, we're going to get it this time. And his blood sugar just went straight up. And I thought, I looked at him and I said, and I looked at him and I said, we just can't do this anymore, bud. We just can't. We've got to figure out a better way. And he said, okay, Mom. So, you know, just very trusting of me as a mom and, you know, that I was putting his best interests first. And so then we, you know, after I found type 1 grit and really started, because even when I found type 1 grit, you know, I was still wanted to make sure that what I was doing was safe for my kiddo. You know, I wasn't, you know, after I was in type 1 grit, I still wasn't fully on board because I thought, you know, I've got to make sure this is safe for him. So, you know, I was just reading everything I could find on diets and low carb. And, you know, I got a lot of reassurance from the members in type 1 grit. But it's the whole thing that we all often answer, you know, ketones. Well, they have ketones now. Isn't that a bad thing? And, you know, all those questions that we all answer over and over again. Are they going to grow? You know, all that stuff. And so I was kind of primed because I had some health issues a few years earlier and some serious ones. I ended up in the ICU a couple times due to medical mistakes. And so I was kind of already primed a little bit to question what the doctors were telling us. I wasn't, you know, sometimes that white coat authority can kind of get in the way of what you see and the cognitive dissonance of, well, why doesn't my doctor know this? And the doctors are telling me not to do this, not to do low carb, but I'm seeing better blood sugars with this. So, you know, why would you not do it? So all of that, you know, was kind of swirling around in my mind, even as I was, you know, exploring it. But then there did come a time right before our first follow-up appointment, you know, we went low carb and then his blood sugars normalized. And I thought, this is it. And then, so we went in with normal blood sugars and the dietitian wasn't happy with us, but
So how much support did you get or are you now getting from your physician or your children's physicians and the nurses, diabetes nurses or dietitians, as you mentioned, Joe?
Do you want me to go or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
So we ended up, we stayed with our diabetes educators at St. Louis Children's, which is where we were diagnosed for the first 5 years, but they were never, our nurse practitioner, I want to say, was great. And she's the one who we dealt with most often, but the dietitian was so bad that I ended up firing her because we just could not see eye to eye, and they would always send me to her, and I just wasn't going to add more carbs to compromise his blood sugar, which is all that she had to tell me was, you know, carbs, carbs, carbs. He needs at least 130 grams of carb a day. If you're not doing that, then you're, you know, he's going to have brain development issues. He's not going to grow. He's just all the myths, you know, all the myths is what she and what she was taught. And she thought, to kind of defend her, she thought that we were doing the epilepsy diet, the ketogenic diet that's high in fat. And those kids did have some growth issues, but that she also never went deeper with us to find out exactly what we were eating. And so she just assumed that we were, gonna not feed our child correctly and, harm him, which, I wasn't going to do. But anyway, 5 years with them, we were in the 2018 pediatric trial with type 1 grit when Dr. Lennox did. I tried to get our endo to read that, and she just kind of refused to read it. So I tried different things. I brought in low carb treats to show her what we were eating, and I tried to convert them, but there was just too much cognitive dissonance. They couldn't come around to it, even seeing his blood sugars. So we ended up switching a couple of years ago during the 2020 pandemic. We switched a couple of years ago to an endo that's actually in type 1 grit, and she's fully supportive of how we manage, and she's great.
Let's give her a mention.
Oh, it's Dr. Catherine Hefner in Springfield, so she's great.
Lester?
So my story is so similar to Jill's that it's not worth repeating. I likewise fired a dietitian. I just was tired of the arguments. We never were supported by our endocrinology practice. We were at best tolerated. We were always reminded that what we were doing was not safe, not proven, not effective, despite the fact that we're walking in with a child 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, year after year with an A1C of between 4.8 and 5.2, just unheard of in their practice. But nobody was interested in what we were doing. And it was always a battle. So it was a battle to the point that when Andrew turned 14 years old, I found an adult endocrinology practice in town that would accept my child at 14. And so we left the children's clinic at 14 and went to an adult practice. And there we are not supported in the sense that they don't know how to help us, but I don't need their help. They don't fight us. We actually get congratulated when we walk in with an A1C of 5, not chastised. And so that's good enough for me. And so I feel like we get the support that we need, but it's frustrating. Nayiri, I mean, here we are 13 years later, I'm bought in. I'm thoroughly convinced that if you feed children a low carb and high protein diet, and the high protein is important. It's important for children. We can be a little controversial in our community. I think adults can eat a low carb, high fat diet and be just fine. I mean, I think it's safer to be ketogenic as an adult than it is as a child, because children need the protein to grow. So you'll hear me a lot, because of my context with type 1 diabetes, harp on low carb, high protein, because the children need the protein. But anyway, I'm bought in. I don't need support. But where I get really angry and frustrated, and where I really like to advocate is, parents of newly diagnosed children who are sort of caught up into, putting all their faith in that white coat that's sitting across the table from them. I think a lot of people that otherwise are very interested would love to have the benefits of a low carb, high protein approach, get told not to do it because it's not safe. And that's the end of it. Like, that's a child lost. And so my goal really is to try to get low carb, high protein to, at least metaphorically, have a seat at the table at diagnosis. It'd be wonderful if the dietitians would say, this is the way we teach everybody according to the ADA. And here's this other fringe approach that, the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners have this statement about. And, if you want to go research about it on your own, here you go. Just introducing the concept, I think, would allow our community to grow from the fringe that it is to some, still small percentage of the population, but much larger than it is today. And so, I think it's important that I don't think we need a lot of support. We need awareness and permission. And the people that want to do this can go figure it out in the year 2024.
Lester, you have a YouTube channel with educational videos on well, various topics, and
That's right.
I've watched a few of them. I binge watched them before this interview, one after the other. So and my husband didn't realize it was different videos. The other day he was saying, is it still the same person, like the same same voice? Because he could hear, he didn't know it was different topics. He were so well, I'll put the link of Lester's channel below, so please follow him, because there is so much to learn from Lester's presentations. Jill, you mentioned their fear of ketones. I'd like to talk about that, because a lot of physicians, and to me, that was shocking to find out, but a lot of physicians have no understanding of diabetic ketoacidosis, or the difference between diabetic ketoacidosis and what we call nutritional ketosis, where you would have a small amount of ketones, or you may actually, you don't always, but you may have a small amount of ketones in your blood or urine, and that is a sign that your body is burning fat, to put it simply, rather than glucose. They can't differentiate between the two. Because I remember when I went to see my general practitioner, it was part of my routine annual check, right? And he said, well, we need to do a urine test. So I produced urine, and he detected, he was doing the, he detected a small amount. It was like, obviously they're not that accurate, but it was something somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5 millimoles of ketones, which basically is an insignificantly tiny amount. And he was suddenly alarmed. He said, you have ketones. And I said, well, that's good news, doctors. I'm in ketosis. And I've fasted, of course. I haven't had anything. I went early in the morning. I hadn't had anything since 5 p.m. dinner. So I said, good news. And he had no idea what I was talking about. He literally did not know. So what are your experiences with ketones and ketoacidosis?
So yeah, well, that was one of the things that the dietitian and I just had to disagreed a lot about. She said, you're going to have ketones. And I said, that's not necessarily bad. And she said, well, you don't want to have any, and you need to flush those, and you need to drink water and get rid of them. And I tried to explain to her nutritional ketosis, and she just, I think they just hear ketones, and they just remember from medical school ketones are bad and diabetic ketoacidosis, and they don't, look further, and they don't look any further. So, it's ketoacidosis is vastly different than nutritional ketosis. The level of ketones is usually in nutritional ketosis is much, much lower. You're not acidotic. The kidneys can buffer the little bit of acidosis that might, be forming, but it's not a problem. And we check Josh's ketones when he's sick. He's usually about 0.3, 0.5. It's not an issue. It's not a problem at all. He's, they told me that he would end up in euglycemic DKA, and that he would have a higher chance of that. And we've been 8+ years and never been back to the hospital for DKA. Never had an issue with ketones. Matter of fact, I don't think that, like Dr. Bernstein says, you don't even really need to check them. It's more dehydration. Dehydration is the problem, and that's what they need to understand, is that as long as you have insulin in the system and you're hydrated so the insulin can get to all your peripheral tissues, you're not going to have a problem, as long as, that insulin can flow and get to all your tissues. It's when you don't have enough insulin and dehydration that ketoacidosis becomes an issue for illness, or even, we had one person that got dehydrated at elevation, and she ended up in a little bit of DKA. So it can happen if you get dehydrated, but as long as you have insulin and you're hydrated, and we do electrolytes every day, so and drink water, you're going to be fine.
I think at this point, the viewers will be wondering, so what on earth are you feeding your children? Yeah, I think, I quite often hear, but how do they get satiated? If they're just not eating the rice, they're not eating those tortillas with it, or they're not eating the pasta, how do they get full? What are you feeding your children, especially growing children who worldwide are known for their big appetite? They're growing, right? What are you feeding them?
Yeah, so at this point, Andrew's feeding himself, so he's in the house. He's a few hours away from us at university. He's been on his own since last August. So what's that, about 6 months, I guess. And he feeds himself the same things that we fed him when he was here, which is a very high protein and low carb diet. And emphasis on protein. And that is the answer to your question about hunger. Andrew is about 6'5", 6 feet 5 inches tall now, and about 195 pounds. He is an avid basketball player, loves the sport, plays probably 5 days a week. He's on an intramural basketball team at his university. So he burns a lot of calories. And so his plates are always constructed around a meat or multiple meats, with, surrounded by low carbohydrate vegetables or salads, and sometimes both. When he was here, that's how we fed him. Now that he's on his own, that's how he feeds himself. A wide variety of meats, beef, chicken, pork, eggs. He eats a lot of eggs. We all eat a lot of eggs. I personally have a daily omelet almost every day, and have, since 2010. I transitioned from being a cold cereal entrepreneur, or cereal aficionado, to being an omelet aficionado. So that omelets are my thing now, and that's it. It's really not complicated. And when Andrew was home, my wife turned herself into a very good low carb baker. And she's very good at it. She could easily open a bakery, low carb bakery, but she has other interests. And so my son had, we provided him with a lot of, low carbohydrate treats. I think those were very helpful, frankly, when he was much younger. I would say from, he was diagnosed in the summer before kindergarten. So he, went to school at kindergarten with type 1 diabetes. And I would say through about middle school, having those almond flour based treats at home were very helpful. And they were helpful in the sense that Andrew got dessert every day at home. And so we did that intentionally. It was a very, thought through decision. And our request of Andrew was, if the surprise cupcake party happens in school, just abstain. Like when you get home, you're going to get Boston poke cake or Italian cream cake. I mean, we're always going to have something here. And when he was much younger, maybe kindergarten through third grade, Ellen would try to keep something at the school, low carb treat, so that he could participate. But as he got older, it was more about abstinence, and you'll have it when you get home. And when he got even older, it was really about abstinence. And so now he's very comfortable just abstaining in situations where there's something that's unsafe for him to eat. And that's where we wanted him to be. We wanted him to get into a place where he was comfortable. And the last thing I'll mention about his diet, because this may surprise some people, I mentioned that he plays a lot of basketball. As a result of that, he fasts a lot, particularly in college, because it's dangerous to have rapid acting insulin on board when you're running up and down that basketball court for 3 or 4 hours. So on most days of the week, Andrew eats a very large breakfast, eats no lunch, or if he does eat lunch, it'll be at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because he's playing basketball from noon till 4, let's say. And then he'll eat dinner. So I'd say most days of the week he eats 2 very large meals, breakfast and dinner. Some days he eats lunch, but it's late. And then on days when he doesn't play basketball, he eats a sort of routine 3 meals a day. But my point is, it is easy and safe to fast when you're eating a very high protein, low carb diet. My son does it all the time. Talking about ketones, I'm fairly convinced he walks around with ketones most of the time, and particularly when he fasts. But we never checked his ketones growing up. Just like Jill, the only time we ever tested ketones was in the context of a dehydrating illness. In fact, we only ever tested his ketones when he was throwing up. And it was primarily just to make sure we were keeping him properly hydrated and that we had enough insulin on board. And we never had dangerously high ketones. Anyway, so that's what we feed him. That's what he feeds himself now. Very high protein, low carb, and I'm pretty sure he's always in ketosis, but that's not a goal.
It's interesting you mentioned, Jill. I'm going to come to you and hear what you're feeding Josh. Josh is, of course, a little younger than Andrew, but I just wanted to interject here and say that my daughter, she's 19, first year college, she's living independently, and she eats what you're describing that Andrew eats. My daughter doesn't have diabetes, doesn't have any medical conditions. She cooks for herself. She eats, and if she happens to eat out, she'll go to In-N-Out Burger and get the double protein wrap in the lettuce wrap. But she's feeding herself high protein meals, and she's only eating 1, maybe 2 meals a day. And I said to her, look, that second meal, go have something smaller. And she says, but I'm not hungry. I said, great, you're not hungry, that's fine.
I actually think that's really important. I think our society has sort of fallen into this habit and trained us that we should eat 3 times a day. And
or
really,
6, as Jill was about.
it's much healthier just to let your hunger guide your eating patterns. Now, I will say with small children that are growing, you got to be careful. You got to make sure they're getting adequate protein and calories. So we got to be a little bit careful about. Small children are different. They can't communicate their needs and desires as well. So that's why you always will hear me with a protein emphasis, because a lot of people that I reach that will watch my YouTube videos, et cetera, are actually trying to raise small type 1 diabetic children. So I really focus on protein. But the older that you get, the less athletic that you are, the safer that it is to just let your hunger guide your food intake. My son probably burns on that basketball court somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day. So when he does eat, he has to be very intentional about it. It's a lot of protein. He's not chasing fat, but he does go out of his way. We've taught him to eat fattier cuts of meat. So my son will always choose chicken thighs over chicken breast. He'll always choose ribeye over sirloin. He actually loves sirloin. It's his preference, but he knows that he needs the calories. When he stops playing as much basketball as he is, I think he can transition towards leaner cuts of meat. But the protein emphasis is really what I think is so important for parents of young children, so those children don't fall off their growth curves and have a legitimate problem that's frankly not caused by the regimen. It could be caused by a lack of protein and calories. And it's easy to do, Nayiri. I got to be honest with you. Just to sort of put a fine point on it, there was a time where we got concerned about Andrew's growth at about age 7. And, Ella and I at that time kept very detailed food logs and insulin logs. They were good for us. They helped us, manage insulin changes in a rapidly changing body. And I told her, I said, I'm worried that we're not feeding him enough calories. He was satisfied. He never asked for any more food. But we actually sat down and did the math on about 7 days worth of food, and we weren't feeding him enough calories. Even as intentional as we were. And it was all about, we were eating, the foods we were eating were too lean. The proteins were too lean. And, they were 4 calories per gram, fats 9 calories per gram. And he just wasn't getting enough calories. I do believe he was getting adequate protein. I don't think he was getting adequate calories. And so having stumbled upon that problem in my own life with my own child, I'm careful to try to make sure parents who are trying to grow these type 1 diabetic children make sure they get adequate protein and calories into their diet.
What is Josh eating, Jill?
Well, he's not much different than Lester, really. You know, we did have some bridge foods early on. You know, I would make waffles, low carb waffles, you know, on All Day I Dream About Food. Had some great waffles, and then there's another recipe on the Novice Chef keto pancakes. So we did a lot of pancakes and waffles, you know, at the beginning. He didn't really care for eggs much when we first started, so we kind of stuck with waffles and pancakes and low carb bread, zucchini bread, those things at first, you know, and bacon and sausage. And then as he's gotten older, we've been doing more scrambled eggs and omelets. But he's an athlete too, so he's working out several times a week in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's swimming too. So he's a pretty busy guy, and he needs those calories too. So we've also been, you know, focused on the protein and making sure that he gets enough overall calories. Rebel ice cream, he loves that, and some other keto. You know, most of these are in the U.S., but you can definitely get on All Day I Dream About Food and find recipes that are great. You know, to make the low carb breads. And then there's pastas too. We've kind of transitioned away from those as much. I used to do more baking than I do now, but the Keto Duncan Hines is also a great box mix for cupcakes, and, you know, for that night before when you get notified that you have a class party the next day, you can just use those Keto Duncan Hines mix and either make cookies or brownies or cupcakes. It's just really, when we first started, I had to do a lot of cooking because there just wasn't the products out there, the keto products that were pre-made. But now there's so many packaged products that it makes life a lot easier for if you're a busy working, you know, parents and busy working mom, and you just don't have time to do all that baking and cooking. You can still do it. And, you know, like I said, Lulu pasta, Kaizen pasta, there's all those pastas. We've kind of transitioned away from that stuff now. We don't eat it as much. We have a breakfast template. You know, we do eggs and bacon or sausage, and then like a legendary cinnamon roll, and those are a little pricey, so those aren't every day. But, you know, then I'll make a bread, or I'll make some blueberry muffins, also Keto Duncan Hines. So all those, there's so many options now to make it so much easier. And like Lester said, actually Lester was the one that when we were in Type 1 Grit, keyed me onto the calories. I think it was something that he said. So then I got on Baylor College of Medicine when Josh was just 10 and made sure that I was getting him enough calories overall, because protein is so satiating that you know, they may not be hungry, but they still may not be getting enough calories for the activity level that they're, you know, at. So if they're playing soccer or playing basketball or in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or martial arts, they need those calories. So you need to kind of figure out what their activity level is, and, you know, their goal weight, and then you just input it. It's a calculator online. You just input it and it'll tell you, you know, 1900 calories, 2000 calories. And then you use MyFitnessPal, put in your meals, or Chronometer is another great diary online. And we use those all the time, just to every once in a while just check to make sure, is he getting enough calories? Because he was always super lean, and I'm always, you know, trying to make sure that he gets enough to eat. And because a lot of times, like, protein is satiating, and Mom, I'm just not hungry, you know. You need to eat a little more. So he's 6 foot now and 140 pounds, so he's lean and mean, but he's doing well, and he grew. And I'm 5'3", so my being short didn't hurt him at all. So
he's still at school, right?
He's a senior in high school, and he's still at home, but he is getting ready to transition to college. And we have a college real close that he was probably going to attend, Missouri S&T. It's an engineering school, and he's definitely a science and math guy. So we'll see how that goes this next year, getting him ready for that. And but he knows how to cook, and, you know, he can make real good chicken tenders in the oven really easy. So, you know, I expect that he'll still be at our house quite a bit. But we'll see how it goes. I'm hopeful that he will be able to transition just fine, and he's pretty committed to his health. Beyond just, you know, I know a lot of parents are like, my teen won't do this, or they don't want to do this. And I mean, I'm thankful that we had the time with him as a 10-year-old to kind of have that time before to kind of get him ready. Because they do, you walk through, you know, canyons of carbs in the grocery store. You're around people that are eating them all the time. So our strategy was to always just have snacks with us, because we homeschool, but we always went to a co-op. We were always out and about, and you know, when you're with people that don't eat the same way, they're going to be snacking on popcorn and goldfish crackers. And so my strategy for him was to always have some nuts, some jerky, some beef sticks, some low carb drinks, water, hint water, vitamin water. I always had something with us, and that helped to prevent any kind of, you know, oh, mom, I want this, or why can't I have that? Because I always would bring things. And I would bring, there's all kinds of protein bars too, and sweeter things that you can bring, like, you know, the Think Keto bars are another one that's kind of a sweet protein bar. So, you know, when somebody else is munching on it.
Yeah, Monk Pack's a good one also, Jill, that Andrew eats a lot of. The Monk Pack.
Right, yeah, he eats those almost every day. So yeah, you can bring those with, and when somebody whips out a candy bar, you know, you can, and your kid's like, oh, I want, you know, you can say, here you go. And I was always prepared.
So Jill, Josh was obviously homeschooled, but Lester, for Andrew went to mainstream school, I would assume. So how did you cope with the school dinner or school lunches?
That's great. So we always sent Andrew's lunch. So Andrew always packed a lunch.
Right.
Make him a little different. You know, the majority of the other students would eat school lunch served by the school. Not everybody, but most would. So that was a little bit of a differentiator. But, you know, he also was taking insulin, which was another differentiator. And so honestly, and I think Jill and I both sort of addressed this and talked about it, it's really just about, you know, explaining the why to the children, letting them understand the payoff. Like, okay, here's why you're doing this, here's the benefit, and then walking them through life. And it just sort of takes care of itself as they age. Like at some point, you don't need those crutches anymore, or you can take the training wheels off. You know, and you don't really have to push it. You just have to hang in there, you know, and support them until they don't need it any longer. And I'd say for Andrew, that happened probably about 8th or 9th grade, where he transitioned from like needing the crutch of a low carb granola bar being around to he just didn't care anymore, you know. And you know, in terms of sort of precise details, now, so he was diagnosed in the summer before kindergarten. I was very fortunate in the sense that my wife is predominantly a stay-at-home mom. She substitute teaches sometime. But when he was in kindergarten and 1st grade, so young, so small, my wife went to the school and dosed his lunch every day. She just didn't trust the school nurse. It was just, I mean, you're giving minute doses of insulin. And so my wife actually, you know, did that every day. In 2nd grade, we handed that off to the school nurse. The school nurse had a couple of years to witness my wife. The insulin doses were up to, you know, 3, 4, 5 units, not a quarter of a unit. You know, we were always concerned about a nurse making a mistake, and this would be easy to do. Instead of giving a quarter of a unit, you actually give 2.5 units. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a 10-fold mistake. It's actually a very common insulin dose mistake, a 10-fold mistake. And those were always frightening to us. So in about 2nd grade, the school nurse took over. When Andrew entered middle school, which at his school is the 6th grade, he took over. So starting in 6th grade, the nurse was no longer involved, and he did his own lunchtime diabetes care from the 6th grade, you know, even through today. And so that's sort of how we transitioned. My wife every day to the nurse every day through, you know, most of elementary school, and then Andrew took over in middle school.
Your stories reminded me of one of the interviews I did as part of this episode, and I'll put the link below, with, again, two parents, Mark from Scotland and Haley from Canada. Haley, well, they both have Facebook pages, but Haley's son had told her, Mom, if I didn't have diabetes, I'd still eat this way. And so having your children on board and, you know, helping them understand why they're eating maybe slightly differently, but then they're not deprived, they're still enjoying life. And that's a very important message. Now, we are going to wrap this up. However, something very, very important I'd like us to go to discuss next. What type of insulin are your children using, and how are you dosing for the protein? Because these are important questions we get asked all the time. And I have to say, I'm a pump user, but I know that neither of your sons is using a pump. So how are you managing the insulin dosing?
Yeah, so I'll start, Jill, if that's okay. So we use today and always have used exclusively Novo Nordisk insulins. In the beginning, that was Novolog and Levemir. And then a few years into our journey, we finally got on board using Novo and R, which is Novo Nordisk regular insulin. And so today, Andrew uses all three. And I'll start by saying that we don't carb count. So people would say, okay, well, if you don't carb count, what do you do? And then they sort of assume that we protein count. We actually don't do that either. What we actually do is Andrew is targeting a certain amount of protein and calories with each meal. And he just knows, you know, if I'm going to eat a 14-ounce ribeye steak, that's equivalent to eating 4 chicken thighs, which is equivalent to eating 6 eggs, which is equivalent to eating, you know, 2 large pork chops. So there is literally no math in what we do. So he'll choose, okay, I'm going to have a 14-ounce ribeye with this meal that handles my protein requirement. Now, what am I going to do in terms of vegetables? Well, I'm going to throw, you know, a cup of fried okra and a cup of steamed broccoli, and I'm going to add a salad. And now I've built myself a 2,500 calorie meal that has a macronutrient makeup that I'm accustomed to. I know what kind of protein and I know what kind of carbohydrates, low glycemic carbohydrate I have here. And I look at my book, because he maintains a little book he carries in his pocket that shows him how he dosed yesterday, the day before, And he says, okay, yesterday for this meal at this time, you know, this type of meal at this time, I took 11 units of regular. And let's say I started off at 90 and 4 hours later I was at 70. And I had to bump my glucose just a little bit. I had to take a, you know, swig of, you know, of glucose to bump that 20 points. So today I'm going to drop my R by half a unit. So maybe today I'll take 10.5. I just described to you how he manages diabetes. It is building a meal around a set of macronutrient goals and then looking at the way insulin reacted to that meal at that time of day in the past few days and adjusting insulin. He does not count, no math. It's exactly like I just described. And then on top of that, and I've got a video on my YouTube channel that really talks this through, he uses fasting blood sugars, you know, so postprandial blood sugars to inform his basal insulin dosing. And Andrew takes Levemir 3 times per day, 7 a.m., 9:45 p.m., and 2 a.m. The 2 a.m. dose was extremely important when he was growing so rapidly. He took very large 9:45 p.m. and 2 a.m. doses. It's less important now as his growth has slowed down. But for Andrew, 2 a.m. Levemir eliminates Don phenomenon and foot on the floor issues. So by taking 2 a.m. Levemir, it's a trade-off he chooses to make. By taking 2 a.m. Levemir, his blood sugar is very steady through about 10 a.m. So he doesn't have to worry about like an intramuscular injection of Novolog as soon as he wakes up, which is what a lot of folks choose to do with foot on the floor or dawn phenomenon. So Andrew chooses the 2 a.m. Levemir as opposed to having to treat as soon as he wakes up. What's nice about that is it gives him a lot of flexibility for when he wakes up. So at university now, 3 days a week, he has classes start at 8 a.m. 2 days a week, he has classes that start at 10, and he can sleep. But that 2 a.m. Levemir dose really allows him a lot of morning flexibility. So that's why he takes Levemir 3 times a day still today. When he was growing so rapidly, the 3 doses of Levemir, particularly the 2 big ones overnight, were really about covering growth hormone. So that's his regimen. It's Levemir, Novolog, Novolin R. Meal dosing is all about, what did I do yesterday against these same macronutrients to inform the dose I'm about to take now? And then basal is all about adjusting based on his fasting or his postprandial or fasting blood glucoses. Jill?
Very similar to what Lester does. So we we've built meal plans or meal templates, and we know about how much protein he's going to eat. So he'll eat maybe 16 ounces. He usually eats 3 times a day. So he'll have, in the morning, he'll have a couple eggs, 4 sausages, and maybe a blueberry muffin or a Pop-Tart or something like that, or a waffle. And we tend to keep the protein component very similar. So, but you can switch things out really easy. You can switch out bacon for sausage. You can, switch that stuff out, and it's really easy to switch out the almond flour component, of the meal plan. So we've built these meals, and he just kind of cycles through them, and whatever he's feeling like that day, he knows his dose really doesn't change that much. So the insulins that we use are, we use Levemir from about 11 years. We started with Lantus, which is what they put us on for long acting. And then we had Novolog, and then we introduced, once we got into type 1 grit, we introduced regular Novolin R. So we started out with Lantus, and then we transitioned. He didn't like Lantus; it burned. The acidic pH just wasn't great for him. So, and he started avoiding shots. So then we transitioned to Levemir, which we liked a lot more. And the benefit to Levemir, now that Novo Nordisk is deciding that it's not a necessary insulin, the benefit to it is that it's got a shorter profile than any of the other long-acting insulins, and so it's easier to adjust quickly. So that's super important when they're growing so fast, because if generally they tell you to wait 2 or 3 days in between adjustments when you're increasing or decreasing your long-acting insulin, but with Levemir we never had to do that. I could increase and keep up with his growth, and so we were able to maintain 5% or lower A1Cs during that heavy growth period. Like when he was 14, he grew 6 or 7 inches in 1 year, and his Levemir was just going up, up, up. And we also split it 3 ways. We did it a little differently than Lester did. I think Lester does it more along the lines of what Dr. Bernstein recommends. I actually split it 3 ways during the day. So we would have a 7 a.m. dose, a 2 p.m. dose, and then an evening dose about 7 or 8 p.m. And then Josh doesn't have a problem with dawn phenomenon. He never has dawn phenomenon or foot on the floor. He's just never had that issue. So but anyways, that shorter acting profile of Levemir allows for us to make those quick adjustments that you need to make. And it's great for athletes. When you don't exercise one day and then you exercise heavily the next day, you've got to adjust that long acting or you're going to go low. So it's very flexible that way, and that's a benefit to Levemir, and I'm really sad that we're losing it. I think it's important to drive home those the uses of it that we're going to lose, that Lantus doesn't have and Tresiba doesn't have, being longer acting insulins. And currently he's using Tresiba as his long acting. We transitioned to that a couple of years ago. I have a love-hate relationship with Tresiba. it's good in that if you forget a dose, your blood sugars are not going to be completely crazy, but it's bad in that it's difficult to adjust quickly. The profile is about, for Josh, it lasts about 28 hours. So there's a long overlap between, even from one day to the next. So definitely changing. And if you have an athletic kid, it's like steering a slow moving ship. You make a change and then you have to wait. And so it's not ideal for women who need to make quick changes during their menstrual cycle. It's not ideal for athletes either. So, especially if you're inconsistent in your exercise schedule. So it's a little bit more challenging, I feel, than Levemir was to get correct, to get that bladder line.
Why did you change to Tresiba? Because Levemir is still on the market. Yes, they're going to pull it off the market. However, it's still on the market, still available. So you've changed from Levemir to Tresiba 2 years ago. Why did you make that change?
So we were starting to hand off the diabetes management, and just the mental load of 3 doses a day, and remembering that was something that I was concerned about that he would be able to maintain. So it was really streamlining his diabetes management, because we don't split Tresiba either. I really wanted to stick to 1 dose a day and see if we could make that work. And so that's what we do. And we have made it work. We've been able to keep his A1C, in the 5 and below range, but so that was the reason why. But it's a little bit more finicky of an insulin. I feel like it's just a little bit more difficult to really get good, nice flat lines with it. And I feel like I had a better handle on Levemir sometimes, although I've used it longer too. So, but the Tresiba, it's slower. So you just got to be more patient in making changes. But I definitely know when it's off, because his whole day will be kind of a little more roller coastery. So definitely we have a window that we look at, when he's fasting, that, overnight, that I kind of gauge where he needs to be. But definitely our whole day will be more roller coastery if it's, a little bit high or a little bit low. And we're talking just like a half a unit. If it's just a half a unit off, which is a tiny amount of insulin, we're going to see the effect of that.
Well, thank you for that. Now let's just finish this off with the CGMs. What CGMs are they using?
So my son,
Josh,
yeah, go ahead, Jill.
Josh is using a Libre 3. So we started with Dexcom. We used the Dexcom 5. We switched to the Dexcom 6, and we felt like there was some problems with it. So we, for a while, we had some alarm fatigue. And so we, for a while, didn't use a CGM at all. And my criteria was, as long as we can keep your A1C where it needs to be in the normal range, then I'm okay with that. But then when he started driving, I was like, well, you really need to have a CGM so that, we can kind of be aware of what your blood sugar is before you get in the car. So then we went to the Libre 3. Actually, we went to the Libre 1, and then our endo was like, oh, you really need to use the Libre 2 because that's approved for children. So then we went to the 2 and then the 3. So, and that's what he's doing.
How do you find Libre 3?
I really like it. I find it really accurate. I know some people don't like its accuracy, but I find it really accurate, and it's small, and it's just, it's great for Josh. He's leaner. I think sometimes maybe the different CGMs work for different people better, but we don't, when he's at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and I'm watching his blood sugar, his phone is up in the gym room with him, and I'm down below working out, and I can just check his blood sugar, and he's good. And yeah, so we never lose connection, and that's nice. So, and I follow just like, it's a CGM, just like Dexcom is.
I'm so tempted to because I was a Libre user until Dexcom. This is 6, I think. Yeah, 6. I can't say I like it any more than the Libre. So I'm just so tempted to switch back to Libre. Only this time it'll be Libre 3, which is so much smaller. And you mentioned that Josh is slim, and I'm slim too. I'm relatively like I'm 5'2", right? And on the slim side. So I appreciate the smallness of the device. I mean, Dexcom with my Omnipod, it takes up my whole arm. It's like
right, and that's that footprint, and then when you take it off, it damages the skin. So I mean, we just haven't had the issue with, you know, taking off the Libre. I mean, you can't even tell. And the 2-week wear, it's easy to, you know, let his arm heal from the adhesive, and yeah, it works good for him.
Mm-hmm. Lester?
No CGM for my son.
Right.
He's never really used one. He has tried the Libre 3. So let me give you a little backstory. He was diagnosed in 2010 at the age of 5. We were not offered a CGM by his clinic back in 2010. It was not part of their standard of care. We didn't even know a CGM existed probably for a year or two after diagnosis. There became a time when the clinic wanted us to put a CGM on Andrew, and we were open-minded to it.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew refused. He did not want anything on his body. He was probably about 7 years old then. So his mom and I, you know, talked about it, and we'd already been 2 years in at that point, and we didn't want to sort of force something on him he didn't want. And so we told Andrew, we said, as long as you keep yourself safe, and in fact, I went even further, which in hindsight I regret just a little bit. I said, Andrew, as long as you don't take an ambulance ride or require assistance from another adult, then I won't force you to wear a CGM. And darn it, I mean, the kid did it, you know, and so I couldn't force him. And so we waited all the way until his senior year of high school. And I sat him down and said, son, you're going to be off at college next year. I'd like you to try a CGM and just see. To his credit, he agreed. We picked up the very first Libre 3 that our local Walgreens had ever filled a prescription for. We were literally the very first Libre 3 that they ever handed across the counter, early October of 2022. And I loved everything about the Libre 3, and so did Andrew, except they were horribly inaccurate for Andrew, terribly. And he couldn't keep them on. So those two things. So he's basketball all the time. He's a very heavy sweater. He's sweating, body sweat. He just couldn't keep it on. In addition to that, the Libre 3s, at least the ones we tried, which to be fair to Abbott, were the very first ones that were available for a couple of months. They almost all of them ran about 40 points too low. So think that through in the context of at that time, a 17-year-old kid, you know, senior in high school, wearing a CGM for the first time. He's sitting in class. His blood sugar is 100 or 90. The Libre believes it's 60 or 50. So it's setting off an alarm on his phone that he can't turn off because that's a critical low.
Right. Yeah.
He pulls out his blood sugar meter, tests his blood sugar, and he's 90. And he just got mad about it. And it became something where he said, Dad, listen, I did what you asked me to do. I experimented with this thing for a couple months. I'm done. And so, we let him go. And so he hasn't worn a CGM. He's off at college. There's some days I wish that he had a CGM on. I really do. But the kid's very disciplined. When he gets into his automobile to drive, when I get into my automobile to drive, I put my seatbelt on. It's habit. I cannot not do it. When Andrew gets into his automobile to drive, he puts his seatbelt on, he grabs his meter and tests his blood sugar. So he understands sort of the additional risk and trade-offs that he's taking, and he does good, smart things to cover for not having a CGM. I would not recommend to anybody that they not wear a CGM. Be very clear about that. I'm just being honest with where we are. Andrew understands that by not wearing a CGM, He's accepting a little bit of additional risk, and it requires a little bit of additional discipline on his part. But he's also an example of the fact that a CGM's not required for great success. So he's been very safe. And I do think he'll CGM again one day. I think it may be after he's out of college and not playing basketball 5 days a week. I think a CGM would be helpful to him. I really believe that, as long as it's accurate and he keep it on. But he doesn't use a CGM, and frankly never has, except for the 2-month experiment we did with the rebate through.
Well, thank you for mentioning that, Lester, that it's not the CGM that guarantees. No, it's not, let me put it this way, it's not necessarily the CGM or the pump, for that matter, that guarantees good blood sugars and good A1C.
It's not technology at all. I mean, the word's technology. And one of the things that I see everywhere in the type 1 diabetes community, particularly the mainstream type 1 diabetes community, is a lot of technology worship. There's this sort of sense that the technology is going to get there, like we're right around the corner, and it's never going to be. It's just not. The technology is not going to solve the lack of a functioning pancreas. And insulin going into the body from the subcutaneous entry point will never be able to do what a pancreas can do in the portal vein. And no amount of technology on the horizon is going to get us there. And I think that's unfortunate. In fact, it's one of the reasons I like to share the fact that Andrew's never worn a pump and essentially has never worn a CGM, not to encourage other people not to do that, because that's not what I'm doing. It's just to make the point that the technology is not how he's been so successful. It has nothing to do with technology.
Technology can be helpful, I have to say. However, it's not necessary. And I'm so humbled. I'm humbled when I come across other type 1 diabetics from different parts of the world who have no access to this technology. They contact me as part of my coaching services for guidance. And I look at their management and they're doing a fabulous job. And I sometimes ask myself, would I be able to do a good job like they are doing without the technology that I have? It humbles me when I come across people who are managing perfectly well without the input from the technology. So it's not necessary. The most important thing, I think, is to manage your insulin properly, to manage your diet. Yes. These are the 2 most important things a type 1 diabetic can and should do.
I completely agree. So I actually very much agree with you that the technology obviously is not required, but I will say this: you do need tools. And Levemir is one of those tools that I'm very concerned about going away. Some of the feedback that I get when I mention that to folks is just put your kid on a pump. I mean, just use a pump. Well, that shouldn't be obligatory. People shouldn't be forced to buy a $5,000 pump. People shouldn't be forced to wear something on their body that they don't want to wear. Pumps have failure modes. Pumps should be a choice, not to mention the fact there's a whole global community of diabetics who will never have access to that technology. So we really, as a community, should be fighting to maintain the insulins that we have. And I feel like Levemir is an important tool. We may lose it yet, but we're going to continue to fight until it's gone.
Any last minute tips or a few liners, certain messages to parents whose children have just been diagnosed? What would you say to them, just to finish this with?
So Lester and I are very active in a lot of the mainstream groups, and we always try to reach out and just let parents know that low carb's a choice, and that it's a valid, safe choice. And then I have a page, it's called T1D and Normal BGs, where the unicorns live, and I post on there. I just post all kinds of stuff. I post our graphs sometimes. I post food. I post tips. So all the time, we're just trying to get the word out to the wider type 1 community, not to force anyone or take any choices away, but just to show them that this is a safe option that is out there for them. And if they want to get off the blood sugar roller coaster and have an option that makes life better and easier for their kids and for themselves to get more sleep, and it just calms everything down, that this option is out there, and that, you know, there are guidelines that are starting to be developed for type 1s, and I'm just looking forward to that. So really excited about what the SMHP is doing. So yeah.
Yeah, as am I excited about what the SMHP is doing. I'm hopeful that it gets us a step closer to having sort of a metaphorical seat at the table at diagnosis. I do believe that if presented the option early, at or soon after diagnosis, a lot more people would choose to live a low carb lifestyle with their type 1 diabetic child if they were aware. It's certainly not something that I feel like, you know, should be forced on anybody, but I do think it should be an option. And I think what happens when that option is not made available, the parents aren't aware, and time goes by, I think two things happen. Cognitive dissonance starts to set in. So when you learn of something new and you need to change, you have to confess to yourself that you've been doing something suboptimally for some period of time. That's one thing that happens.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that happens is you get into a routine, and you have this, you know, the devastating diagnosis. You struggle and find a new normal, and then, you know, you reach sort of good enough. And so, you know, if you're walking into your pediatric endo practice with an A1C of 6.8, you're getting patted on the back and told you're doing great. You know, you're exceeding ADA guidelines. And so now, you know, I have not only the cognitive dissonance, but I've actually found something that's working. The problem is you've really got to be honest with yourself and educate yourself on what that 6.8 A1C means 20 years from now. Because that pediatric endocrinologist is only going to see your kid, and the clinic in my town only sees children through the age of 17. The day they're 18, they're out. So you're sitting there with a 10-year-old child. You know, best case scenario, that clinic's going to see them for 7 more years. They're going to live with diabetes the rest of their life. You got to think about 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now. And so you've got the two things. You've got the cognitive dissonance, and you've got the sort of good enough, and it's very difficult as humans to make changes, period. And so I think it's so much easier if folks are exposed very close to the time of diagnosis. And I think we lose a lot of people. I think a lot of people lose the opportunity because they're not exposed until much later, and it's much harder to transition. And I mean, Jill and I are examples. We both made the transition within the first 60 days of diagnosis.
Well, this was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We should repeat, and because we'll always have lots more things or topics to talk about.
We'll have to do some college updates.
We absolutely should bring the boys over as well. Now they're old enough to actually sit here as guests without the support of their parents. I'll look forward to that, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation to come and inspire people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.